Philosophers who would say that knowledge is always a prison that keeps us trapped in a world that is rather than a world or a situation that could be. The imagination helps us to reframe everything. Vision, innovation, all of those things are a result of an imaginative practice. They are the byproduct of the imagination.
Many of them probably over time have lost a piece of themselves and a connection to others, and not by desire, just by default. If I asked you, what is the most essential leadership skill of your time? I bet imagination would not even be in your top 10. I think by the end of today's episode, though, we will be convinced that imagination belongs in the top 10 things of how well it fuels innovation, equity, and resilience within organizations as a leadership skill, and why leaders who fail to cultivate imagination might even risk repeated old systems instead of designing new futures. We are in season 11, where we're focusing on rediscovering human needs. And imagination, I think, is one of those human needs that also strengthens the organizational culture. So I'm really, really excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. David W. Robinson Morris. He is a scholar, an author, a strategist who works at the intersection of imagination, equity, and transformation. He's the founder of Reimaginelution, a strategic consulting firm helping organizations radically reimagine their structures, policies, and practices to create cultures of belonging, impact, and liberation. He has over 20 years of leadership experience himself across higher education, healthcare, philanthropy, and nonprofits, has served as the inaugural executive director of the Institute for Black Intellectual and Cultural Life at Dartmouth College, executive director of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, and founding director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier University of Louisiana. He's the author of Ubuntu and Buddhism in Higher Education and co-editor of Contemplative Practices and Acts of Resistance in Higher Education. So really, really great to have you here.
So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so Dr. Robinson Morris, you call imagination a core leadership competency, but most MBA programs do not teach this at all. Why?
Well, for a number of reasons. The first is that most MBA programs are designed to optimize existing systems. They are designed not to question the systems themselves. Right?
Makes sense.
They are really, it makes sense in one way, but it doesn't in another, right?
Yeah.
Because they're built on prediction, they're built on efficiency, they're built on control. And imagination, by contrast, is disruptive, right? It disrupts consistency, it disrupts control, it disrupts prediction, and it introduces uncertainty into the mix.
Ooh, yeah. That is, okay, I just want to pause here because what a light bulb moment that the way that you just described how we just teach and learn about leadership and organizational structure, it makes sense that we start with, I guess, the quote unquote fundamentals of operations, which involve control and efficiency. How can we increase product? Well, we decrease, we remove, we extract, right? And yet imagination, the way that you're describing it, is the opposite of that, because it creates that sort of question, the uncontrollable, the curiosity. So tell us more about kind of the disconnect and what imagination could bring that we're really missing from discussions around leadership and organizational development.
Sure. These are all the questions I love too. So thank you. Thank you for these questions. Imagination, I think it's Albert Einstein who said that imagination is more important than knowledge, and that knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world, right? When we come to educate, it is important, as you very well said, for us to understand the foundations, for us to know how to do the thing that's already been done. But in some ways, there's some philosophers who would say that knowledge is always a prison that keeps us trapped in a world that is rather than the world or a situation that could be. And so the necessity of imagination to push beyond, to move beyond what is into what can be is critically important, right? Which does make it disruptive. Imagination in a business sense helps us to ask what works, but not only what works, what else is possible that we haven't even been conditioned to see, right? Which is really what I wish MBA and leadership programs would ask. What else is possible that we have not yet been conditioned to see, right?
I
That is
love that.
critical.
Yeah, yeah. What are the things that we're conditioned to see that makes it so hard for us to imagine something else?
Uh, this is, I was having a conversation with some dear friends. I'm working on lots of projects. And because of my training, because of my education as a researcher, my brain automatically goes to the holes of an argument. And so we will have a wonderful meeting, right? That is successful and will come out with all of the outputs and outcomes that we desired when we went in. We'll come out with huge wins. And someone will ask me, how do you think that meeting went? And my brain automatically goes to the things we didn't do right, to the places where we could have improved, to the things we forgot or failed to say, right? I think our education in a large way is much the same. We are trained, especially those of us in leadership and business, to look for what can be improved, to look for what can be shored up, to look for where the leaks are, right? Financially or with products or with personnel. And we are very seldom told to find the joy in it, to find the positive in it first, right? We conduct SWOT analysis out the yazoo, right? And most often in the SWOT analysis, the largest section of the SWOT are the weaknesses and the threats, right?
Yes.
Because that's where our brain goes first.
Yeah, yeah. And what you're saying is more about how important it is to also see the possibilities, not just the gaps, not just the problems. I'm curious, how do you
Yes.
apply it to, you started talking about SWOT analysis, strategic, planning, strategy. How do you apply it to business strategy, finance, and communication? The things that we're taught, that are taught in MBA programs. What is missing from that kind of training and how we think about strategic planning, how we think about financial planning, how we think about communication that imagination could add to?
Yeah. It's the imagination helps us to reframe everything, in my opinion, right? I think it's Dante Roy who reminds us that another world is possible. And not only is she possible, she's on her way, right? And what we have learned is that in a rapidly shifting environment, we see the rise of AI, we see climate change, we see global political unrest. Technical skills alone, which is what you learn in an MBA program or in leadership programs, are insufficient. That organizations that nurture imagination, that people who nurture the imagination thrive in the face of disruption, right? This is about thriving. So in strategy, for me, imagination is the ability to see beyond the trend, to see into discontinuous futures, right? It is what allows an organization to move from reactive planning to generative positioning, right? In finance, for me, imagination shows up in scenario building that goes beyond best or worst case scenarios, right? That goes beyond the threats and weaknesses, or even the opportunities toward fundamentally different economic logic. And we're talking about a different logic, especially in the face of volatility or transformation. In communication, imagination for me is the capacity to translate complexity into meaning across different in ways that are simple and understandable. It's what allows leaders not just to inform for me, but to invite people into shared worlds of possibility, into dialogue with one another across difference. At the Reimaginelution, we say without imagination, strategy becomes repetition, finance becomes compliance, and communication becomes broadcast, right? And we have enough of all of that.
Yeah, yeah. Woo, that's a lot. This is
Yeah.
amazing because what you're saying is this is the solution to all of the complexity and disruption and the chaos that we feel, when in fact it could be a way through, a way to get to that next outcome, the next future. And so I would love to hear some examples of some of these. Like you mentioned, complexity into meaning. You mentioned shared dialogue. You mentioned thriving in the face of destruction. Do you have some examples of how to use imagination to help us through those kinds of really challenging transformations and through
Yeah.
lines?
Yeah. First, I would say, yes, of course, I have examples. The key for me to the imagination first is coming back home to yourself, right? The imagination, contrary to what people think, is not a thinking thing. It is a feeling thing. It's affect. It's energy. It's alignment. And so it requires us, in my understanding, to be at home with ourselves in our bodies first, and to have the ability to feel or intuit something and turning off the thinking brain for a moment, right? We can come back to logic and rationality, but I want you to suspend that and just to feel into possibility, right? To provoke something that is not there yet. We've seen this done, and I've done this a number of times with organizations, right? You go in and the leader is very hesitant, right? And most often it's not the leader that's bringing me in. It's the leader above the leader who says, hey, we have to try a new way. And so I'm already encountering reticence, right? And the first thing that I do in a workshop or in a situation is to ask people to breathe. And I laugh because most often they say, well, listen, you have all of these credentials. You want me to breathe? I want you to tell me how to get out of this situation. And my first response is follow your breath first, right? So coming back to your body, which allows people to lower their guard, right? And it really allows for the mind and the body to do its thing. And then we begin to have hypothetical conversations, right? Outlandish scenarios, asking folks to get out of their comfort zone and for everyone to enter into a space of vulnerability so that we can have the dialogue across difference, or we can come to a solution about a thing that we've been ruminating over for a while. It works really, really well in business environments with folks who are so focused on numbers, right? And the bottom line and supply chains and all of the above, to say, hey, imagine this work if you had no barriers and you were wildly successful. What would that look like? What would that feel like? What would that smell like? What would it taste like to be wildly successful? What would you hear in the space? How would you feel? And then to ask folks to share that out. And you'd be surprised at the depth of conversation that folks are able to have, and at the solutions that bubble up to the surface just in a recalling of what they imagined, right? That are outside the realm of their everyday toolkit. One CEO said, this is magical. And I said, no, it's the imagination, right? This is not magic. This is what happens when you listen to yourself and you are still enough to hear yourself.
I have a bunch of questions now about this. One is, many of my listeners are highly credentialed experts, thinking, analytic, skeptical folks. It's really hard for them to step out of that often.
Yes.
And so I suspect that when you enter some of these spaces, you sometimes get the, yeah, but it's not possible because, but how, we can't really make that happen. All of the sort of taking us back to grounding it into quote unquote reality. What would you say to that as someone who comes into that space, helping people just be able to let go of some of that in order to step into the experience of the imagination piece?
Yeah. I would ask them that opening question, right? What have you been conditioned not to see?
Oh, nice.
Right? It goes back to that. And to allow for them the space to feel the answer, right? Most often when I encounter what you just described, folks are saying, the risk is too high for us. The reward, we can't see it, right? We're looking at the risk and we don't have time for folks to sit around and breathe. And my response is you don't have time for folks not to sit around and breathe, to be able to move themselves outside of the situation you find yourselves in. And what I communicate is that you have been defining risk so narrowly, right? It's probability multiplied by impact. That imaginative leadership has to expand that frame. It has to ask, what risk are we unable to see, right? Go back to that question, because of the stories we're currently committed to. What story are you currently committed to, right? And many, in my opinion, of the great organizational failures are not due to miscalculation, right? They're due to an imagination deficit, an ability to sort of think creatively about something or innovatively about something that is at hand. Imagination, I've seen this over and over again, allows leaders to rehearse futures before they arrive, right? Everything begins in the imagination. Everything. From the glasses on my face to the computer that I'm sitting here, talking to you through. The internet existed first in someone's imagination. And that ability to rehearse allows you to surface futures and their blind spots, right? It's data, if you think about it in that way. The imagination provides you with data that sort of the material world alone can't reveal to you, right?
Yeah. And what this is making me think a lot about is just how do you have imagination deficit? Well, the way that we have an imagination deficit right now is that we have too much information that we're attending to all at the same time and not enough time to be still, as you said, not enough time to just think and dream and imagine.
Right.
And, with my own kids, I have purposefully encouraged boredom as like a positive thing because
Yes.
what I see that comes out of their boredom is absolutely amazing. When they hit that spot where I'm bored and I actively refuse to entertain them or offer them anything, like they have gotten into crocheting and teaching themselves how to play guitar and teaching themselves how to sew and like creating books and like all of these things that could never have happened if I didn't just let them be bored, quote unquote bored, so that they could just sit with their imagination for a second. And we lose that as we get older, as we, get into adulthood. We think that's a quote unquote waste of time.
Right.
But here
Right.
you are making a very solid case that is like so far away from a waste of time. Yeah.
Completely. In the academic world, right, in the scholarly world, we call that intellectual curiosity, or sitting with wonder and awe, right, which we don't ever talk about anymore in sort of common narration, right, around the world.
Yeah.
Everything has to be concrete and proven and static. And we know that is not reality. The natural world teaches us that.
Now tell me, is imagination different from or integrated with, like, how is it connected to creativity, vision, innovation, all of these other terms that sound similar to imagination? Like, how do you connect these all together?
So the others, vision, innovation, all of those things are a result of an imaginative practice. They are the byproduct, right, of the imagination, and largely involve more of the brain than the imagination does, right? As I said earlier, the imagination for me is a thinking thing. It's a projection of a future, a thing, a situation, a feeling, an environment that has not yet been made possible in the physical, but is very much existent, right, energetically. And those things are just byproducts of that practice.
Makes sense. Your work is rooted in Ubuntu philosophy and contemplative practice work. And one of the things that I think is like super interesting is that you have said historically marginalized communities have actually been modeling imaginative leadership for centuries. I would love to hear how marginalized communities have used imaginative leadership and also how it might be rooted in Ubuntu and Buddhism and contemplative work, and how we can sort of learn from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Robin D.G. Kelly wrote a wonderful book called Freedom Dreams that talks about this extensively in a different way, but is a beautiful sort of representation of it. Historically marginalized communities have had no choice in some ways, right? But to imagine beyond the constraint in order to survive, in order to create life, in order to thrive in ways that we define thriving. And so it's been necessity. The imagination has been necessity. Could be called, or is often called, prophetic hope, right? Especially in the Black intellectual tradition, we talk about prophetic hope, and it is this projection of a future that is not yet, where we are no longer suffering in the midst of our present day suffering, but it is active. It's what I call a muscular hope, right? It's a hope that does something. And it's a hope that allowed babies to be birthed and people to be born and innovations to spring forth. It's a hope that allowed for the civil rights movement, right? And all of these advances, especially in the Black intellectual tradition. And so it is bedrock. It is bedrock to who I think marginalized communities are. It shows up in collective economic systems created outside of formal capital access, right? It shows up as cultural practices that preserve identity under pressure. It shows up as mutual aid networks before shared value became a term in corporate America. We had mutual aid societies and networks. It shows up in spiritual and philosophical traditions that insist on dignity, even in conditions of dehumanization. Like, that's how important the imagination has been. When you look at Ubuntu or Buddhist traditions, the imagination too is bedrock. Imagining a world and understanding the world as deeply interconnected and interdependent when everything else in the society tells you it is not, that you are singular, right?
Yes.
Is not only an imaginative practice, but what we know is that it is a real and lived practice, right?
And what a disruptor too.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Yeah.
It has to disrupt the current order, because the current order in some philosophical and cultural traditions is out of order.
Yeah. A lot of what I'm taking from this also, specifically around the interdependency piece and the collective piece, is, cultures that are much more focused on individual outcomes, individual successes, like the US. It also leads to incredible isolation, mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, because you feel you're all alone, and you're constantly feeling like you need to be in competition with other people. You're never going to be good enough. You don't have enough of a social structure or support system to be able to question whether that's accurate or not. And one thing that I guess I wonder, when you work with leaders within organizations where you're teaching them to rehearse, to practice a future, is if they've only had the experience of this kind of individualistic culture, could their rehearsing of imagination or a future get them stuck in anxiety spinning and rumination instead of a collectivistic, like what we could do together? And if so, like, what do you do with that?
Yes. There's always, again, the imagination is disrupting and disorienting, right? And it's that on purpose. And so there's always a point where someone will say, but what about me? Right? Not what about us, but what about me? And you feel the spin. This happened to me last week. I was facilitating a strategic planning process for a local nonprofit organization here. And one of the members, at the end of the process, I could feel the anxiety coming off of them. And so I simply said, would you like to share what you're feeling at the moment? And whoa, it was an anxiety ridden 15-minute sort of stream of consciousness download to the whole room. And I wasn't uneasy, but the executive director, you could see them fidgeting in their chair. And at the end, they said, why'd you allow them to do that? I said, because they needed to. And we need to model how to move through it. And that's what I did for you. I let it go too long. 15 minutes is way too long in a group setting, but we have to model it. And what I often do is allow people to get it out in ways that are not harmful to everyone else in the room. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the first piece. And I bring them back to a question, right? They may ask me a question. I'll bring them back to that question. Hey, you asked this. What do you feel about this question? But the anxiety is a part of it. It is a huge part of coming. Here's how I explain it. It's a huge part of unlearning what we've learned, right? Or remembering what we've learned to forget, as Cynthia Dillard would say. How do we be together in moments of joy and in moments of discomfort, understanding that we have to move through a process together? So in real ways, it is how we practice communalism, right? It's how we practice interdependence. Those moments are models for how we can move through it. The other thing I'll lift up is that there's always a moment in most sessions, and with human beings in particular, right, where we begin to spiral, because what dawns on us is that we could have done this differently all along. Mm-hmm. Right? We did not have to be stuck in this cycle, and we could have done this differently. It is the process of liberation, right? I often say that in most oppressive systems, the imagination is completely void, and it has to be, right, for you to be able to be subjugated under that oppressive system. So it's the first thing we have to get back. And when the unlearning occurs, we have to begin to move into modes and phases of healing, right? And healing not in sort of the woo-woo way, right? But healing as defined by recognition of our full humanity together, right? It's the capacity to see the fullness of your humanity and the humanity of the person next to you, and to work through that in real ways.
Yeah.
Not always easy, especially in corporate settings where we are taught largely to not be very human.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also though, like we're, for leaders who have been part of like these sort of traditional, individualistic, more oppressive systems, what I think is scary and hard is that many of them probably over time have lost a piece of themselves and a connection to others, and not by desire, just by default, right? Yes. And there is an incredible personal gain to reconnecting with those parts of ourselves, right? It's not just for the organization, it's for our personal well-being that we might want to engage in this way. And one of the sort of ways that you're describing how like this can unfold, right, is just imagine a leader who, like the one that you described, actually decided to share very vulnerably and openly what he was or she was experiencing, right? Which takes a lot of courage. Many leaders just keep it inside. But like that is important to know because of the risk that it creates by not naming it. The risk that it creates for them, the risk it creates for the organization by not naming what is driving your decisions behind like all the fears and all the anxiety and all the sort of worry. And I'd love to get a little bit more into that risk mitigation because you've made some connections between imagination and risk mitigation. For those leaders that are listening and are like, I can't even imagine applying this, and this feels so squishy and soft and like sand, it's slipping between, what is the connection to like mitigating risk for current organizations facing lots of disruption right now that like all they're doing is just cutting, staff and doing layoffs to try to quote unquote save the organization because of siphoning money? Where does
Mm.
imagination place itself here with risk mitigation and with addressing kind of these things for individuals?
Yeah. Yeah. As I said earlier, it moves us beyond that probability times impact formula, right? And moves us into really questioning, right? The imagination also forces questioning. It forces inquiry in a real way. And so it moves us into questioning, what story are we telling? What story do we want to tell? Most organizations, when we start talking about risk, my question to them becomes, and it does feel like a soft question, but it isn't. When this is narrated in 10 years, what is it that you would like for them to say about how you handled it, about how the company handled it, about how people were treated, and about, because I'm imagining the generative, and about how you came out of it successfully,
Mm.
right? And those are not soft questions, right? Those are questions that really put into focus, especially when we talk about risk, one's integrity, a company's integrity, a company's values, and it tells us where their priority lies, right? So these are things that really help us to see clearly where we are, who we're devoting our time to, or what we're devoting our time to, and how we think the work that we do should be made manifest in the world. And so in that way, for me, the imagination becomes extremely important when you calculate risk,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just risk of the bottom line, but there's so many other tangible and non-tangibles that we don't always take into account when we talk about risk.
Yeah. What comes to mind that about how you're describing this is that framework. I think it's by conscious leadership, the above the line,
Mm.
below the line. Are you familiar with this
Yep.
one? Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
for our listeners, in this framework, when you're below the line, you're acting from a place of risk and threat. And when you're acting from a place of risk and threat, you are much more likely to have a scarcity mindset. Everything's
Mm-hmm.
smaller. You're more likely to defend yourself, protect yourself, your organization. And that means taking very few risks and not really being able to see beyond that. And what you're doing is trying to move them slowly through imagination to being, quote unquote, above the line, which is an abundance mindset, a creative mindset, an ability to imagine what could be, an ability to imagine that there's more available to me. And that takes, like some skill to help people move to from a fear-based, perspective, a threat-based, we're under siege, we're gonna fall apart, we're the Titanic and I'm the Band-Aid, that kind of like
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, feeling to, yes, that could be your experience. And there might be more to this if you can just hold on for just a second,
Yes.
pause,
Yes.
imagine all the things you're not seeing because of the tunnel
Yes.
vision that happens when we're under threat, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all of these kind of like visioning, coaching, future oriented, abundance thinking questions that you offer to help people slowly move back up to that more expansive thinking. At least that's kind of what I'm
Yes.
hearing and how you're describing it.
I think you're spot on. I think for me, it takes the same amount of energy, because the scarcity thinking is imaginative thinking, just in a regressive
True.
way, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it takes the same amount of energy for me to exercise our generative imagination as it does our regressive imagination. And so it's really helping people to see this isn't something new and this isn't something abstract. This is something you use every single day, right? Your imagination is always employed. You have a choice on how you will use it, right? Will you project futures of possibility, or will you project futures of loss and
Mm.
dehumanization and regression or scarcity?
Wow. Love it. Love it, David. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me, how do you start leaders moving with incorporating this as a daily practice? Like there's the retreats that you just described, right?
Definitely.
And then there's like all of the practice needed to stay in that place and not to go back
Yes.
to the other place. What are some
Yeah.
things that you do to help people stay in that imagination led practice?
Yeah. It is a practice, and practices are not always perpetually sustainable. And so we will fall out of it. And that's the first thing I tell people. It is a way of being in the world that is different from the way that you've known. And it is not required to be held perpetually, right? We are human. You will fall in and out of it. But the first thing I ask them to do in this practice is to go back to that question, right? That original question. Ask yourself in every situation, what are we not seeing because of how we are currently trained to see?
Mm-hmm.
And sit with that question, right? Don't rush the answer. Let silence do some of the work for you. And because the imagination rarely arrives in organizations that don't make room for it, make room for it, right? Sit with it, be with it, and trust what comes up for you. Trust what comes up for you. I think it's Tony Robbins who does this little experiment with people all the time, right? Where he would say, stretch back the furthest that you can. They would do the exercise and some would maybe get, moderately far. And he would bring them back to center and he would say, all right, now close your eyes. Imagine yourself stretching the farthest that you can. Take a deep breath. Open your eyes. Close your eyes. Imagine yourself stretching farther than what you just imagined. Take a deep breath. Come back to center. Open your eyes. Now imagine yourself stretching the farthest you've ever stretched in your whole life. And then he has them do the stretch. And most of them far exceed, right, where they were at the beginning. It is that type of practice, right, that we have to see it first before we can achieve it, is exactly what it illustrates. But it's that if you encounter something that seems insurmountable, take a beat, close your eyes, take a deep breath, imagine yourself moving past it. Imagine the solution, right? Come back to it. Take a deep breath. Imagine a better solution, right? And it's this daily habit of that.
Yeah.
Is where I ask them to start.
Very similar to what many elite athletes, often say they do. They visualize, right? They visualize making the shot over and over.
Yes.
They visualize making the shot. And leaders can do this too with exactly what you're saying. They visualizing a future that they had imagined for themselves and continuing to make it more and more clear in their mind. Some people will say manifesting, right? It's kind of like the same sort of idea behind that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Same idea. I often tell folks, I've been doing a lot of work in religious communities lately, which is surprising and not surprising at the same time. And most often they'll say, well, this seems kind of like new agey and all of those things. And they'll say, well, what's the definition of faith? Seeing things that aren't as though they were and moving toward them. It's the same thing, right? It's the exact same thing.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Tell me more about, you mentioned this could be a disruption. You mentioned we're sort of like disconnecting kind of in a way with oppressive systems and thinking. You've called this kind of like a revolutionary act. Tell me more about that piece of how even the most conservative leaders in very kind of traditionally hierarchical, bureaucratic, or old school organizations can do this in a way that is both revolutionary and good for them and good for the system.
Yes. First, you're already doing it. You're already practicing your imagination, right? The point I made earlier is that imagination is bidirectional. It can go either way, right? It can be generative or it can be regressive. And so for me, the revolution for me is a shift from leadership as control to leadership as generative possibility, right? It's a move from organizations that primarily manage risk to organizations that actively expand what is possible and provoke possibilities in the world. The revolution for me is a redefinition of what we have, termed intelligence itself. It is not an accumulation of data or credentials, but the capacity to responsibly imagine futures that sustain life and that allow everyone to thrive according to their own definitions of thriving, right? That's the revolution. For me and for the work that we do at the Reimaginelution, the heart of it is not improving broken systems. I want to be clear about this. It's not about improving broken systems, but it's about expanding the imaginative field in which those systems are created, right? The move is transformation, not simply change, not simply reform. It is transformation. That's the revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. Incredible. Is there anything that, as we start closing out, that you want to make sure that people leave with? One thing that is kind of most important to hold on to as they're thinking a little bit more deeply about this?
Yeah. I go back to your question around Ubuntu and Buddhism, right? And Ubuntu is always right above my head in all of these calls. It's a reminder that imagination is not just individual brilliance, but it is collective emergence, right? And that contemplative practice, which is deeply important, is necessary to create interior stillness. It's necessary for us to see beyond our inherited assumptions. Without stillness, for me, imagination becomes noise. And with it, imagination becomes perception. And so together, right, Ubuntu and contemplative practice shift leadership for me from extraction to connection, from urgency to presence, from control to relational intelligence. And if we are to be, do, see, feel, think our way out of the world we currently find ourselves in, or the suffering we currently find ourselves in as a global network, we need the imagination. We need relational intelligence. We need stillness to provoke new possibilities for more generative futures. Again, where all of us can thrive, not just some of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one very like low hanging fruit thing that every leader can do is what every leader usually complains about, which is, I don't have enough time, right? I want more time to strategize. I can't have strategy time because X, Y, and Z is taking away, right? And the only way to take that back for yourself, because the time is there, time is always here. It's all around us, right? The only way to get that back is to schedule that time and be ruthlessly protective of that stillness that you described, David, right? Like be really ruthless and protective of that time to access what you described as a practice.
Yes.
Maybe
Completely.
together with others.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. And start with 5 minutes. Start with 3. Just start, right? Take some time.
Yes. Incredible. Those of you who are interested in learning more about Dr. David W. Robinson Morris, you could go to Reimaginelution, Reimaginelution, reimaginelution.com. You could also go to centerforthehumanspirit.org or drmphd.com. Those are all his initials with the doctor in the beginning. So everybody, what did you take away from today? And more importantly, what is one small change that you can implement this week based on what you learned from David? Share it with us on LinkedIn. You can, share a little bit nugget. You could even tell us, I spent 3 minutes on this exact thing today, and we will absolutely cheer you on. So make sure to let us know how you're applying it. And if you enjoyed this podcast today, you can subscribe. You can go to my YouTube channel, Dr. Mira Brancu, or anywhere you find your podcasts and subscribe and follow and share with others. And thank you, everybody. Together, we, Ubuntu style, we will navigate the complexities together of leadership and emerge stronger on the other side. Thank you for joining me and Dr. David W. Robinson Morris today on this journey. This is Dr. Mira Brancu signing off. And until next time, stay steady stay present, just like he described, and keep building those hard skills muscles. Thank you, everyone. Take care.